Hello, everybody, and welcome to this month's RSA webinar. I'm Dr. Meredith Doig, President of the Rationalist Society, Australia's oldest free thought group. Before we begin this webinar, I'd like to invite you to join with us to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their continuing connections to land and sea and community. So tonight, it's a real pleasure to have with us Dr. Rebecca Banham. Rebecca is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Tasmania, and I think possibly the first guest speaker we've had from Tasmania. So welcome, Rebecca.
Always happy to represent Tasmania.
Indeed, yes, indeed. Rebecca's particularly interested in the rising rates of non-religion that have been expressed through the census in Australia, but not just in Australia, around the world, as she will explain. And of course, it's this which has particularly interested us here at the RSA. So, Rebecca, before you begin your formal presentation, would you like to just give the attendees a bit of your background and how you've come to be interested in the phenomenon of non-religion in Australia and elsewhere?
Yeah, absolutely. So hi, everyone, and thank you for coming along. So when I did my PhD, which is a few years ago now, my project was primarily about environment. So I sort of placed it primarily in the field of environmental sociology. I was really interested and excited to think about how people form emotional connections to the places within they live. And their sort of ontological connections to these places. So what does it mean to connect to a natural space and have that tell you something about yourself? So for me, doing my PhD, that was about Tasmanian forests. If you know anything about Tasmanian sort of environmental politics, forest politics, then it's a really sort of fraught area, but they're very beautiful spaces and really, really meaningful spaces. And I was trying to think, what does it mean to care about these spaces? So I sort of moved through my PhD, and the really key thing for me was how do people understand who they are in sort of an emotional, ethical sense in connection to things bigger than themselves. And then I moved into a project about religious diversity. If you keep in touch with me, then we've got a book coming out next year based on this project. So it was about religious diversity in Australia, primarily in Melbourne and Tasmania. And so I learned a lot about sort of moving from the idea of how people connect to spaces and places into how do people connect with the people around them, using a lot of the same kind of ideas of ethics. So I started to move into the religious space, thinking about rituals, thinking about practice, and then moved into this non-religion project, which is where the blog post came out of. So I'm now actually working at UTAS's Menzies Centre, which is the UTAS's medical science, medical research institute. So I've sort of had to make a bit of a sideways leap again, because that's often how academic career trajectory works. But I'm sort of trying to still bring forward that idea of being excited about how people sort of make their lives ethically rich and how they think about their trajectories. So that's really what's driven me to think about non-religion, is this idea of thinking that it's not just a lack of religion, it's a rich and engaging way of engaging ethically with the world that isn't reliant on a religious worldview. So it's not just a lack of something, it is something. So how do we articulate that?
And I say, Rebecca, it's so good to hear you say something like that, because so many people think that if you do not follow a religion, if you don't have a faith, then somehow you are lacking in morality or lacking in a system of ethics. So it's really good to hear you say something like that.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, great. Yeah, so I think that's kind of my story is, my academic story has basically been sort of what kind of ethical interests can underlie quite differing topics.
Okay, and I think you're going to share some slides with us.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll get started. My talk today is based in a blog post, an academic blog post that I wrote. And so this was hosted by the Non-Religion and Secularity Network. They have a blog. It's awesome. Definitely check it out. So it's the idea is essentially that we have academics writing blog posts about their research, about events they've been to, those kinds of things. So as an aside, I was planning on doing a bit of a follow-up post for the NSRN about today's presentation. So yeah, so this is kind of the host for the blog post, and I've included the link there if you're not seen it. But the project that I was actually working on is called Non-Religion in a Complex Future, and I've included the link there as well. So this is a sort of very international, really quite huge project. Based out of Canada, USA, Brazil, Argentina, UK, Nordic countries, Australia, looking at the rise of non-religiosity in all of these different sites, focusing on education, migration, health, environment, and law. So it's a massive project, absolutely massive, and looking at quite a few different things. So I've been mostly involved in the environment and law sections of this project. Part of that has been a project about, we've called it trekking to be a bit more sort of international. Here we'd call it bushwalking. Depends what country you're in, basically. But also a project about community gardening. So the idea of connecting to nature through walking or through gardening, these things as non-religious practices. So what does it mean to have a non-religious worldview? What does it mean to connect ethically, relationally with the world in a non-religious way? How do these practices inform what we're doing? And the law project that I've been involved with was looking at the legalization of same-sex marriage across all of these different research contexts, and how religion and non-religion potentially came into conflict with each other, into tension, how different legal arguments were mobilized, whether religious or non-religious, whether by religious actors or non-religious actors, about same-sex marriage in all of these different countries. So it's absolutely massive. I would definitely recommend, if you're interested, have a look, because it's an incredible project, and I think we're going to find a lot of really, really exciting things. I think it's about halfway through at this point. It's a 7-year project. So yeah, so there are these sort of really big, huge research spaces happening that, yeah, it's got a lot of potential. There's a lot of things to look up.
Okay, and we just, for those who might be interested in that network, we can always send out the linkage when we follow up after this.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And any specific questions you have, I'm very happy to address as well. So that's kind of the context for my work in the blog post. And I will emphasize that the blog post was sort of a side project. It was not something I was paid to do necessarily. It was sort of a little side interest that I noticed while I was working with other academics thinking about non-religion. So it was just something that it really just stuck out to me. As soon as the news reports started coming out about the census results, it was just so incredibly clear that there was something that people were reacting to. There were just some really inflammatory responses. So I might just back up here for a moment and just acknowledge that, like, religion in Australia is really complex. So we're an incredibly religiously diverse country, increasingly non-religious, as many of you would know. In terms of the sort of legal system in Australia, it's secular. But what does that actually mean? It can be sort of ostensibly secular, but Christian privilege often underlies a lot of what has been written into law. I think politically the situation is really complex. It often doesn't work very well to be overtly religious. See a lot of how people have responded to Scott Morrison as kind of an example of how it doesn't necessarily work to be overtly conservative. But at the same time, there's clearly a really big way that having a conservative voice does work. So, and then also the history, like religious history in Australia, is also really complex and under-acknowledged as a really complex space. So in terms of history, there's a long, long history of Indigenous religiosity, spirituality, depending on how you're going to sort of define it and talk about it. But also in terms of colonization and then early experiences of Islam, Buddhism, Christianity in Australia. Trading contributed to a lot of this. Then we see the White Australia policy, then ongoing migration. It's a really complex space of Australia's history of religiosity. So it's really, I think what I'm trying to say is we have these really mixed layers of different responses, different power structures, and different ethical orientations towards what Australia is and what Australia should be. And so then we have the 2021 census. As many of you will know, this is, the time that we've had the highest response of people describing themselves as non-religious or having no religion. So 38.9% of people said that they had no religion. And this is significant. This is higher than any single Christian denomination. The only higher rating, you know what I'm trying to say, is, if you lump all of Christian denominations in together. But what's quite interesting about this, if you look at it methodologically, is this is still a description. So to say that you have no religion is only a small part of who someone is, and also only a small part of how they think about themselves as an ethical being, as a ontologically, like who they see themselves, where they come from, what's the right thing to do, all of these things that, and also the other people that they relate to. So all of these things that have often been sort of the domain, like historically been the domain of religious kind of doctrine or stories. So it doesn't tell us how else people identify. If they say, I don't have a religion, it doesn't tell us how else they identify. It doesn't really tell us that much about what they believe, what they practice, the groups that they belong to. And it's sort of potentially necessarily, but it's also grounded in the negative, that you have no religion. So you lack something, you don't have this thing, rather than I do have this. So I suppose that's what I'm trying to sort of point out at this stage is that there is something potentially problematic about not having a religion being always grounded in the negative. But then how you work through that methodologically, particularly in the really constricted kind of form of a census, that's a whole other big, big question, which I suspect we'll maybe get into in the Q&A today. But it's something to flag now that there is some methodological kind of stuff to think through there. Moving on from that, so we have this census, we have these responses. And so how has the media responded to these rates of non-religiosity in Australia? And I really want to emphasize here that what I'm going to present today is not meant to be representative. I'm not saying that every media response was like this, or that this was necessarily some kind of blanket response or anything like that. This is just kind of my observations of some sort of concerning responses in some very, very wide-reaching publications. So I just want to flag that I'm not trying to say this is everybody has responded this way. But in terms of what I did find as like some sort of basic in the sort of 2 to 3 weeks after the census results have been released, some sort of basic trawling through Google News, looking for keywords, research. I did notice a really interesting theme of sort of concern, defensiveness, and potentially like fear. So, like I said, we see various responses. There were some responses that were really highly conservative. Some of them were sort of pretty unsurprising commentators, we'll put it that way, but very highly conservative and really outspoken, used a lot of hyperbole, a lot of like really pushing, saying that this is a huge problem. So the version of this, these slides that I presented at a conference a couple of months ago, I used the God is Dead, Stan Grant's headline, because I just thought that was so beautifully hyperbolic. That was the one that just sort of got me interested in it in the first place. And some were more restrained in terms of their response, but there was still sort of this underlying kind of implicit message of Christian privilege and a concern about these rising rates of non-religiosity. So the really easy ones to see are the really big outspoken ones, but then there were some that were just like not saying it outright, but there was still this sort of underlying message of this is something to be concerned about. So throughout all of this, I think there's a lot of sort of, and this is sort of really mainstream, particularly newspapers, but also online publications in Australia, this implicit understanding of we'll say religion, but reading between the lines is generally Christianity, as a primary source of morality, social cohesion, or Australian sort of national identity. There's this kind of assumption that religiosity and ideally Christianity is what underlies being a good Australian. So I really started to think as I was reading some of these responses, what are the implications of this commentary? That seems really problematic and really reductive, that is what makes a good Australian for people who have a lot of reach in their commentary. They have a lot of influence, they have a really large audience, they have a sense of, they're imbued with authority by having such a large audience. So what does it mean if we then imply that to be a good moral Australian who's respecting the sort of underlying morals of Australia, that keeps people together, that keeps Australians together, what does it mean to say that Christianity is the best way to do that? So that's kind of where I was coming from with looking at some of these responses. So I'm just going to run through a couple of sort of the things I was noticing when I was looking through various responses. So the clearest examples of concern sort of express this sense that the census revealed something really unsettling. But then there was also this sense that Christianity is still important. So it was really interesting reading it. It was like, something's gone really wrong, but also it's okay, Christianity will bounce back. There was this really interesting kind of tension there. And I think this quote from Greg Sheridan in The Australian represents this really, really well. So it says that the census is this explosive dam burst, flood of biblical proportions to follow. I mean, it's obviously buying into this really sort of hyperbolic, religiously based language. History shows Christianity's ability to rise from the dead. So there's this kind of tension of like something's gone really, really wrong, but Christianity will be okay. So I saw this quite a few times, and I was like, what's going on there? That these really hugely wide-reaching publications are happy to publish this, basically. And so we also have this idea of abandoning Christianity. It's obviously very sort of emotively based. So I just have a few headlines here. The classic kind of pun of losing my religion is also kind of based in this. So we see this idea of abandoning God, Christianity plummets, or not my tribe, Australians have turned their back on religion. So there's this kind of sense of, it's not just that people are living their lives and maybe they're less often identifying as religious, or it's this sense of like actually they're actively turning their back, they're abandoning Christianity, really pushing religiosity away, and that's a problem, which I found really, really interesting. That obviously that is part of how mainstream media works, is to do that kind of really emotive thing. But why is that what we're trying to emote? The idea of that religiosity, Christianity is being abandoned rather than sort of a shift away. So this is part of what I was really, picking up on. And again, not necessarily representative. There were plenty of articles that don't go for this kind of commentary, but I tried to focus I focused my research on sort of really mainstream publications. And for example, so many of them were from The Australian. And The Australian has a readership of 4.4 million people. which is a huge proportion in Australia. So I think it's really worth putting into context that even though this is not necessarily representative of commentary about the census, it has a huge readership. It has been given a really, really broad, sanctioned, I suppose, kind of viewing. So this is being sort of, I guess, sanctioned in this way. So yeah, and
Rebecca, can I just
other,
ask you?
Yeah.
Could I ask you though? Were you surprised by that? I mean, we know that the Australian is is a conservative, generally on balance. That does have some progressive journalists in it, but on balance, it's more conservative. So, did this?
I
Did
wouldn't say I was
these sorts of
necessarily
headlines surprise you?
I wouldn't say I was necessarily surprised so much as it was just quite striking. So there's also like a lot of sort of quotes I found around like the idea of the core beliefs of Australia being undermined. That so I've got a couple written here. That Australia is increasingly divided on moral issues, that we've lost the sort of bedrock of Australian values, and by that they mean Christian values, sort of state it really outright. I think that was, rather than being surprised, I think that's what really struck me, was that it's just quite overt of that these commentators with this huge, huge reach are saying very overtly that Christian values are what underpins Australian values for them, which for many reasons is incredibly problematic. So yeah, I wouldn't say I was necessarily surprised. It was just more the overtness maybe surprised me a little bit, which kind of leads us to thinking about, okay, so if we're talking about religious Christian values, the privileging of these values, then on the flip side, who are we talking about as the non-religious people? So what are these articles talking about as, like, what does it mean to be not religious? And so again, I found some really interesting examples of that basically in these writings, non-religious people were, that non-religious people are atheists, which is not always the case. You can very well be not religious without being atheist. That non-religious people are anti-religion, again, not necessarily the case. Some people will be, some people aren't. And also this idea that religious people, non-religious people are lacking something. We talked about this at the start. So we can see this in these three quotes. Got this idea of that they should be devastated, these results should be devastating for people of faith, but it's not, despite the glee of secularists and atheists. I mean, this idea that everyone non-religious is just rubbing their hands at this idea. And again, that atheists. That people are becoming less religious, but why have we chosen to live without God? Like, why is it that we're living without something? And also very sort of particular understanding of what God is and what God means. And what I fear more is the secular disrespect that feels triumphalist at the loss of religion. So again, this idea of that, yeah, people who don't consider themselves religious are A, lacking something, B, disrespectful, immoral, there's something missing there,
Just
C,
generally negative.
they're aiming to not be. that they're aiming for the sort of anti-religion kind of, yeah. So there's kind of this, I think that's the flip side that's often not considered, that it's easy to look at how people are responding to these kind of figures, but not necessarily saying, what does that mean? Like, what are the implications of what people are saying about non-religious people? Yeah, so I suppose just to finish up, like, again, this is sort of a really, really small sort of side project that I was doing, and not a representative kind of sample. But what I found really interesting about this is that media responses, and in this case, media responses to the census, are driven by narratives. And they're driven by narratives that work for certain reasons. So we know, and we know that Australian media landscape is thoroughly monopolised. And that's sort of come into relief in the last week or so with Rupert Murdoch, essentially retiring. So why is it that those narratives work? What is being pushed forward, and why? By whom? And which voices are amplified over other voices? But I think it's also interesting that these responses to the census are really reflective of tensions around religious diversity in Australia. So incredibly diverse country, rising rates of non-religiosity. We've got this really sort of vocally conservative minority, underpinned by a real sense of Christian privilege, but also often that sense of privilege can be expressed as a sense of persecution when things aren't going so well as perceived by that majority. We see this in other ways too. It's the same kind of idea as like men's rights activists, that once something starts pushing up against this, privilege that people have experienced and enjoyed, then it becomes perceived as a sense of persecution. I think we can see that quite clearly in Australia in terms of Christian privilege. And so in all of this, I'm curious, and I would love to hear some ideas from everyone about what this says about Australian nationhood, and the role of sort of key voices, amplified voices in Australia. Because I think we have this really interesting sense of Australia as like a progressive country, but then we have this really strong conservative voice as well. But then how do we compare ourselves to other countries? Other countries are experiencing the same, very similar things. Other Western countries are experiencing similar rates of non-religiosity and also pushback, but with different sort of dynamics. And so much of what Australia does is rooted in this idea of international human rights obligations, but then often we do kind of a terrible job of that as well. So how does that interact with religiosity and religious freedom and discrimination in Australia? So I suppose I'm just really interested to hear some ideas about what this kind of response says about Australia as a nation, what people think. And a big part of that is what it means for you living as an Australian in Australia, and how these responses make you feel, and how you understand that reflects on the people around you as well. So, yeah, that's throwing it out as a question.
Thank you, Rebecca. I wonder if you could maybe stop sharing your screen, and might see if I can just bring up the chat box, because there's some interesting commentary in the chat box, which I can, if I can get it. There was a comment by Andrew Holliday, who says this, and I think it's relevant to what you were just talking about there, that many have felt, whether it's real or not, a growing gap between social attitudes and those in power, ostensibly representing society, and the growth of non-religiosity when compared with the very obvious and often very aggressive rise in religion at political leadership levels. So even Kevin Rudd through to Scott Morrison, and that he suggests that this has spilled into mainstream media at many levels. And one example that's changed in the last 10 or 15 years is that famous people rarely, if ever, die. I'm not quite sure what he means there anymore. In Australia, they used to. Now in the US, oh yes, the way that people talk about somebody who dies, they now use the terminology to pass on or simply to pass. So I think he's making reference to changing terminologies. And he says at first glance, this appears respectful, but it isn't. It presupposes a very narrow range of beliefs, all unsubstantiated. At the same time, it completely ignores the rising numbers across Australia who don't buy into any of these beliefs, and simultaneously expects those people to politely leave this alone out of respect for those who do believe. And the question is why. Every culture, every belief system understands and accepts terminology about they just died. So why are we now implicitly being forced to accept pass or pass on, maybe out of some sort of misguided respect? Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple of things going on in that comment. But the major thing that prompts for me is I think it's useful to think about Christian privilege in Australia as similar to other forms of privilege. So in quite the same way that, over 50% of the population are female, often our voices are not amplified and not represented in mainstream media. We are an incredibly ethnically diverse country, but it's often still white voices and white experiences, like very, very often, that are amplified. So I don't think this is like a particularly unique thing to religion or Christianity. I think it's very, very interesting how a minority group or a small group can still be incredibly amplified. So maybe people are familiar with this, but there's a really great concept of intersectionality, where we see different forms of privilege or discrimination kind of layered on top of each other. So the experience of, say, a white man, a black woman, a white woman, a black man, broadly speaking, will be very different experiences of those different sort of forms of privilege and discrimination layering on top of each other. So I think it is like, yes, I absolutely hear, and I think it is incredibly problematic that so many people in Australian society could identify as not being religious, and that is still often overlooked and even dismissed as a lack of something, or a less moral or less fulfilling kind of way to approach life.
But let's move on to the questions. Time's getting away from us. Let's move on to the questions that were sent in beforehand. And I'd like to, there's a question from David Donaldson, which was about your interaction, if any, with the Australian Bureau of Statistics and the census, being the census officials. Have you had anything to do? Have you shared with them your conclusions in this project?
No, I'm going to have to be super boring here and say that I haven't interacted at all. Like I say, this is sort of a side little project. Maybe if I had some time and money to do it sort of a bit more thoroughly, then I would approach them. But yeah, unfortunately, I have to be boring there.
Well, we've actually found that they're quite receptive to submissions or even correspondence.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
you might just want to find out somebody to in the
Yeah, I
ABC
think that's a great
send
idea.
a copy of your blog.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's I might well look into that, I think.
Okay. Jeffrey Williams from New South Wales says, and I think this sort of raises or goes to one of the main points of what you're talking about here. He says, although religious belief might be irrational, is it possible that its demise might be detrimental to society? And the specific question is, do you think that the reduction in religion is the cause of the increase in physical violence in our community?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I suppose the research part of my brain kicks in and says, "Are we sure that there's an increase in physical violence?" That's probably something to maybe, yeah, maybe some assumptions underlying there, or yeah, I'm not sure. I think I find it really interesting studying studying religion as a non-religious person, because I have this absolute fascination for what it means to be religious or not religious, that I don't have very much of a personal kind of investment in. I find it really fascinating when people are religious and it means something to them. I find it really fascinating when they're not religious and that means something to them. So I think it's really easy to boil being religious down to belief. And that's a really sort of Western Christian focusing on the cognitive kind of way of privileging thinking about religion. But religion and being religious is often about a lot more than just belief. So it's often about the relationships that you have with people, the communities you're a part of, the practices, the rituals, the emotions, all of those kinds of things. So it's not just about belief. So yes, maybe you can look at somebody who has, religious beliefs and say, yep, I can disprove a lot of this, or all of it. It's not rational, but humans aren't rational. We don't do rational things so much of the time. So I think religion and being religious does a lot for society that is not encapsulated in rationality or not.
Well, we can
Whether
have
that's a positive or not is a whole other big question.
I've always thought that it's very rational to be to recognise the irrationality of humans. Anyway, let's move on. And there's a couple of questions here which are really seeking your counsel about how to get the powers that be to recognise that secularism, which includes a recognition of non-religiosity and the increasing proportion of people in society who consciously I now identify as having no religion on the census. How can we influence governments, do you think, to recognise that this is an important way of maintaining a fair society? Because you talked about diversity before. I think sometimes the leaders of the non-mainstream religions, Islam, Hinduism, Judaism, and so on, that they might get as frustrated as those of us in the non-religious community who are struggling to have our voices heard, because it really is dominated a lot by the Catholics and the Anglicans, and there's historical reasons for that. But do you have any sense, or did you deduce from any of your research colleagues ways that we can raise the voices of those of us who are representing the increasing proportion of people in our society who are non-religious?
That is such a good and massive question. The self-centered part of me wants to just immediately say, support your researchers. Because we look into these things, we have all these amazing people doing amazing work, and it's really, really difficult to bridge that disconnect between academic work and in academic work doesn't only mean sort of ivory tower, really hard to access kind of stuff. It also means people working with institutes, with community organisations, working at the ABS, all these people. And it's really often very difficult to bridge that disconnect between people doing this work and noticing these things and saying, yeah, this is a really important issue, and then putting that forward as a really well-informed argument that is publicly available and publicly supported. So I think that would be my first kind of thought there, is support academia, support research, support people really thinking carefully about these things. Otherwise, I think a good understanding of that it's quite difficult sometimes, that we have people who so there are people that are very loud and put their message forward, and even if it's something that you sort of ethically agree with, it's not necessarily a well articulated or well thought through message. So sometimes it's, I think, really important to step back and think carefully about how you put the message forward.
Julia Mizuno has a comment about this, and my comment about the minority religions finding it hard to find a voice in the public square as well. And she says that the minority religions, in her experience, are happy to exclude the non-religious as well, especially now that the Christian denominations are finding that they need to curry favour with the smaller religions to uphold the overall religious bloc. Same sort of thing has happened with those who say that they are spiritual but not religious. They're all lumped in with the religious bloc, because I do think it's partially about power, and power is in numbers. That's what politicians recognise, because that's where the votes come, and what politicians are concerned about is getting re-elected, and therefore what they're looking for is as many votes as possible. And that's one of the challenges that you're going to find, Rebecca, because there's not a lot of votes in education or research, and even fewer votes in research, unfortunately. Yeah.
Yep. Yes.
Anyway, let's move on. Now, here's a question which is a little bit off to the side, but it may speak to the origins of your research. Gillian Mort from Queensland says, are there any indications that non-Indigenous Australians, okay, those of us who are non-Indigenous, are forming connections to land and sea and flora of Australia in a spiritual sense.
Mm.
Did your research go to that at all?
Yeah, so my first thought there is so I've recently been writing a couple of things where because my initial PhD research looking at how people were connecting with forests was not at all about religion or non-religion. I was in a different space. But I've sort of written a couple of things lately where I'm sort of reading non-religion, non-religiosity into those practices as, sort of ethical, ontological practices, things that tell us about who we are that don't have a grounding in religiosity. So in that sense, I mean, yes, you could potentially read my work in that way. I also know a PhD student here at UTAS who is looking at hiking as so hiking like different tracks as a sort of spiritual creatively informed practice. We have a philosophy student here at UTAS who's also looking at can nature experiences be understood as sort of an atheist kind of version of majesty of I think I'm explaining that badly, but that's kind of thing. So they're like really close examples. I know there's heaps of research on this. So yes, absolutely. Long story short, yes, absolutely. And there's a lot of research on this.
And Richard Dawkins has recently written a book about the wonder and awe of nature, which I suppose some people might interpret as being a spiritual approach to understanding nature.
Yeah.
And, so that's
So with the non-religion and complex future project, the hiking bushwalking project I was talking about before, it's oriented around awe. So the idea of awe as a non-religious kind of experience of those ethical ontological practices.
Rebecca, we're fast running out of time, but I just wanted to wrap this up and maybe invite you to say a little bit more about the Non-Religion and Secularity Research Network. And in particular, maybe can you make a comment about whether our experiences in Australia are similar to or different from the colleagues that you have in that research network? Do you have any impressions about that?
Yeah, awesome question. I think it's been really interesting to see Canada and Australia have a lot of similarities along those lines, like both Commonwealth countries, fairly similar sizes population-wise, quite similar sort of religious breakdowns, and sort of a quite high migration intake. So a lot of similarities there. It's been interesting, particularly with the law project. So with the environmental stuff, like if you're thinking about community gardening or people hiking and trekking, a lot of those experiences have been a bit more sort of individual based. And so it's been quite, in a lot of ways, quite heterogeneous across the different groups. So a lot of those experiences are really, really quite similar. People are finding the same things, experiencing quite similar things, different contexts, but similar experiences. But then when it comes to the law kind of side of things, so very different. So like I say, Australia and Canada, some deep similarities. But then if you look at, say, the Nordic countries, there's a really, say, if you look at Norway, there's a really different relationship between sort of state church and lawmaking than we have in Australia. In Brazil and Argentina, a lot of political upheaval in the last 50 years and then combined with a strong Catholic influence, it means that law plays out quite differently. And yeah, so on and so forth for America as well, UK as well. So some really clear similarities, I think more so with individual experiences, very
But not on
when
a
it comes to
systemic or
legal
political level.
context.
Yeah. Okay. But as I said, we'll add in a link to that research network for anybody who's interested in following up a little bit more about the projects that are going on, including your project, which, as I understand it, is just one of a whole range of projects looking at secularity and non-religion in a number of countries. Rebecca, thank you so much for explaining your research. We have recorded this session, and as usual, we will be placing this on the RSA's YouTube channel, but we'll also send it out to everybody who has registered for this webinar. So thank you everybody for your attendance and for your questions as always. Watch out for our next webinar, which we hope will be from Dr. Ben Jones, who wrote the book on referenda, and in particular the Republic referendum. So if you're interested in that topic, watch out for our next webinar, which will be in 4 weeks' time. So thanks everybody, and enjoy the rest of your evening.